Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Canon EOS R5 from a video perspective, having used the camera now for over a year and across multiple firmware updates. Canon packed so much into this camera that even a year after launch it remains one of the most powerful and feature-packed bodies around for video, not to mention one of the very few to offer both 8K and 4K at 120p. In this review I'm covering everything from movie quality in 1080 to 8K, autofocus performance, as well as covering the thorny issue of overheating. This video complements my earlier review of the R5 for stills photography, so do check that one out for an in-depth look at the photo quality and features, as well as a general overview of the body and controls. Before diving in, a big thank you to Storyblocks for sponsoring this review. Setting the scene and mood is an important part of every video, but you don't always have the resources to film at all of the locations you'd like. This is where a Storyblocks subscription proves invaluable, giving you unlimited access to an enormous and demand-driven library of royalty-free video, audio and photos for you to enhance and importantly complete a project. Let's say you're making a travel or nature video and want to open with a soothing forest at sunrise, or perhaps the crisp fjords of Norway, or maybe a flyby over the iconic American Southwest. Well, a Storyblocks subscription has you covered. The unlimited all-access plan provides full access to all their stock video in 1080 and 4K resolutions, along with After Effects templates, photos, illustrations, music and even sound effects, which you can use as much as you like in any of your projects, allowing you to easily achieve the look and feel you really wanted. Learn more about how Storyblocks can make your life easier in the link below. Okay, now back to the EOS R5, which I've been shooting with since it was launched in July 2020, and I've also been using it for all of my RF lens tests since that date. I've also compared it against new arrivals like the Sony Alpha 1, and I've retested the body after each of Canon's firmware updates. Now, any review of a camera with such an ambitious feature set is going to be a moving target, and even as I completed this video in mid-2021, another update had already been announced. So most of my tests were made with firmware 1.3.1, but do check my channel for tests on future updates. I'm also presenting this video in the slightly wider DCI shape and in 4K resolution, so try to watch it on your biggest and best screen. First, a quick look at the main body features for video. In terms of ports, there's microphone and headphone jacks, a USB-C port for charging or power with compatible power delivery sources, and I used an Apple MacBook charger with no problems at all, and a micro HDMI port for external recorders. Now on the downside, the tiny HDMI port that Canon's chosen for the R5 isn't anywhere near as robust as the full-size versions you'll find on Sony and Panasonic's best cameras, but on the upside, Canon is at least now allowing that HDMI port to deliver 8K RAW to a Ninja 5 Plus, or cropped 5K RAW to a Ninja 5, both in the ProRes format and available later in 2021. You can compose and review with either an electronic viewfinder or a fully articulated side hinge screen, which also supports an excellent touch interface that provides direct and quiet access to a wealth of adjustments as you film without needing to enter menus or turn clicky dials. This is a key advantage over Sony's interface. Fit a native RF lens and you can unlock finer aperture increments of 1/8 of an EV, another key benefit over most rivals. Oh, and Canon's finally added zebra pans too. There's dual card slots, one for CF Express and the other for SD cards. All movie formats can be recorded to either type of card apart from the higher bit rates of 4K 120 and 8K RAW, which both demand faster CF Express cards only. Now at launch, the R5 only allowed simultaneous video recording to both cards if one was set to 8K RAW and the other to a lower res proxy, but a firmware update due later in 2021 allows dual recording in all but the two most demanding formats, so that's a really important update. In terms of video formats, the R5 presents the core options on a single menu page. You're looking at the options when the R5 is set to PAL, and I'll switch to the NTSC options afterwards. The main menu has 3 rows, with resolution and aspect ratio at the top, letting you choose between 1080, 4K and 8K, with 4K and 8K available in either the standard 16:9 or wider DCI shapes. From the middle row you choose the frame rate from 24 to 60p, while on the bottom row you choose compression from IPB Light, Standard IPB, All-I, Raw Light and Raw. Now depending on the quality and other settings, various options may become greyed out and unavailable. For example, 8K is only available up to 30p, and at the time I made this review, internal RAW recording was only available for 8K and in the DCI shape. Now, while it would be nice to internally record RAW at low resolutions, it's important to remember that internal RAW recording is a rarity and a key benefit of the R5 over any of its rivals. When it comes to full frame 4K, the R5 lets you record in a standard mode up to 60p using line skipping, or in the better quality 4K HQ mode, which oversamples from 8K's worth of data, but it's only available up to 30p and with shorter recording times. I'm going to show you the quality difference in a minute, but for now, this is how it changes the main format menu. If you want frame rates higher than 60p, you'll need to enable the high frame rate option. This lets you film 1080 or 4K at 100p when set to PAL, or 120p when set to NTSC. When you set to 4K, you can choose between UHD 16:9 or the wider DCI shape, but regardless, everything is encoded in all-I and without sound. The bitrate for 4K 120 is sufficiently high to demand a CF Express card, but following feedback, Canon added a more modest 1080 option, which will squeeze onto SD cards. Cropped filming is also possible with the 4K mode oversampling from 5.1K's worth of information and applying a 1.6 times field reduction. Regardless of your filming mode, the EOS R5 continues Canon's policy of clips no longer than 30 minutes. This is, after all, a non-cinema camera in their range. While some of the modes are so demanding they can't actually record for much longer than 30 minutes without overheating, others can record for hours, so it's frustrating this limit is still in place. Sony and Panasonic have been offering unlimited recording on some models for ages now, so this is a major downside for anyone recording longer content like events or interviews. For clips longer than 30 minutes on the R5, you'll need an external HDMI recorder. Which leads me to the R5's biggest issue, and that is of course overheating. Now, I've made many videos about this and YouTube is absolutely packed with them, so I'm going to keep it brief here. First, the good news. When filming in 1080 or standard 4K up to 30p, I didn't experience any overheating, with the R5 happy to keep recording until I ran out of memory or power, albeit again in those half-hour clips. But now the bad news. Set the R5 to 8K, 4K HQ, or even just standard 4K at 50 to 120p, and you will experience overheating sooner rather than later. In my tests from cold, the R5 typically overheated and stopped recording in any of these modes after 20 to 45 minutes worth of continuous footage, depending on the mode and on the surroundings. Even if you capture shorter clips though and stop before overheating, the R5 will gradually build up heat, with the available recording time gradually depleting until the red zeros of doom appear and it won't let you record anymore in these particular modes, after which you'll either need to switch to a lower quality mode to keep filming, or simply turn the camera off entirely to recover more time for those better modes. But beware, simply not using those high modes is not enough to cool the camera down and retrieve more recording time. If you switch to lower quality video, start taking photos instead, maybe review some of your work, or even just line up a shot or browse the menus, then you will not recover any recording time at all for those higher quality movie modes. If you want more 4K HQ, 4K 120 or 8K, you simply need to switch the camera off entirely for some time. Typically, I needed to leave the camera off for twice the time I wanted to retrieve. So to get 5 minutes of recording back after overheating, I'd really need a 10-minute cooldown. This may be workable for some situations, but it could be a deal breaker for others. The strange part though is, unlike Sony cameras which can become hot to the touch, the R5 doesn't actually feel particularly warm when it overheats. Various tests have also indicated the recovery period may be linked to an arbitrary timer, as well as monitoring the actual temperatures, and that it may be possible to reset the timer to unlock full recording times again, but this is all done at your own risk. The bottom line is Canon's more risk averse than Sony when it comes to heat, and in order to meet its operating parameters, the R5 takes an arguably overcautious approach. Maybe future updates will let owners decide how much risk to take, but at the time I made this review, you need to be constantly aware of heat management when using the R5's best modes. And that is, after all, why you bought the R5, right? This sadly means limiting your use of 4K 120, 4K HQ and 8K, ideally recording shorter clips, and crucially turning the R5 off where possible, or resorting to lower quality modes when it's not. Alternatively, you could use an external recorder, which also has the benefit of bypassing Canon's annoying 30-minute clip length. Ultimately, if you're buying the R5 for video, you need to be acutely aware of its limitations and what it will and will not do. If you want a camera that's happy to record beyond 30 minutes without an external recorder or without any overheating concerns, or indeed one that can switch between photos and video without worrying about cooldown periods, then you'll be better served by other models. If you need 4K 120 from full frame with autofocus, that means using something like a Sony A7S III or an Alpha 1. And if you want 8K as well, the Alpha 1 becomes your best option. But that camera is $2,500 more than the R5. Okay, now let's look at some video from the R5, starting with why you'd want those two headline video features of 8K and 4K 120. Let's start with 8K, and you're looking at some 8K footage filmed with the EOS R5 right now. Looks nice enough, right? But since this project's edited and presented in 4K, what's the point of a camera that can capture 8K's worth of pixels? Well, beyond providing the data required for the excellent 4K HQ mode, actually filming in 8K lets you crop the footage by 2 times when editing and still have 4K's worth of detail, letting you punch into a frame and scroll around it if you like, with no loss of quality. You can punch in a further 2 times while maintaining 1080p quality too. Here's another example, followed by 4K and 1080 crops. Now, of course, there are caveats to filming in 8K, from bigger files to shorter clips, not to mention a greater necessity for very high quality optics and very stable support too, but I enjoyed the opportunity to magnify small or distant subjects. It's also nice to know you can grab still images with over 30 megapixels worth of resolution from 8K footage. Here's a clip I filmed in 8K, and now here's a closer look at a still I took from it. This can work so well that I've now filmed a number of events using video with the intention to grab stills from it later. If you'd like to see more 8K in action, check out my EOS R5 8K compilation, all filmed, edited and presented in 8K. Moving on, filming in 4K at 100 or 120p lets you slow the footage down by 4 times in a 25 or 30p project, or by 5 times in a 24p timeline, all while maintaining 4K quality. The R5 can also autofocus effectively at 120p, but unlike Sony, it slows the clip in camera and won't record any sound. The bitrate is also very high in 4K 120, demanding CF Express cards, and the maximum recording time is 7.5 minutes per clip, and that's in real time. So let's have a look at a compilation of 4K clips that I filmed on the R5 at 120p, slowed by 5 times in my 24p project. See you in a minute. If you'd like to see some 4K 120 footage with long lenses, do check out my reviews of the RF 400 2.8 and RF 600 f4 Super Teles, as well as the RF 100 to 500 zoom. For me, 4K 120 is arguably the highlight of the R5, but there's no denying it chomps through both your memory and overheating timer at quite an alarming rate. Luckily, Canon added support for 1080 up to 120p though at more reasonable bit rates in a firmware update. I measured the earlier 4K 100p rate at 1572 megabits per second versus a much more reasonable 327 megabits per second for 1080 at 100p. Here's a compilation of clips I filmed in 1080 100p, slowed in camera by 4 times. Okay, now let's see the difference between 1080, 4K and 8K on a real life subject filmed with an RF 24-70 at 35mm f8. First, you're looking at standard full frame 1080 24p, which is only available in the standard 16:9 shape, so you'll see a slightly narrower image here with black bars down the sides. Next, for standard full frame 4K 24p in the wider DCI shape, which uses the full sensor width, but it does skip lines. Now for 4K 120p, again in the DCI shape with no crop, and playing back 5 times slower than normal here. And next for the 4K HQ mode at 24p, which oversamples from the full 8K sensor for better quality. And finally, here's the R5 in 8K at 24p in the DCI shape, but I've presented it here in a 4K project, so to really see the difference between them, I'll need to punch in. So here are 400% views of 1080 footage at the top, standard 4K in the middle, and 8K at the bottom, where you should see progressively superior quality from top to bottom. Apologies for any wobbles in the footage. Now let's swap out 1080 at the top for the 4K 120 mode, that's playing back here in slow motion, but hopefully you can see it's maintaining decent quality. And next, swapping out the slow-mo for the 4K HQ mode, where it's delivering crisper results than the standard 4K in the middle. 4K HQ mode is one of the highlights of the R5, but again, it's only available up to 30p and it does overheat the camera faster than the standard 4K modes. I love real life tests, but sometimes you need a chart to really see the differences. So here's my standard resolution chart filmed in standard full frame 4K. So let's take a closer look and make some comparisons. So first with 1080 at the top, standard full frame 4K in the middle, and 8K at the bottom. All filmed with an adapted Sigma 40mm 1.4 art lens at f8 in 24p and presented this time at 600%, so this is a 6 times magnification. Next, let's switch the 1080 at the top for 4K 120 slow motion. And now switching this to 4K HQ mode, where you can see the benefit over the standard line skipped 4K in the middle. And finally for 4K in the cropped mode, where it oversamples to potentially outresolve standard full frame 4K, which is still in the middle. Note I had to move the camera away from the chart in the crop mode to match the field of view. Next here's the Canon EOS R5 in 1080 at the top, with the Sony A7S III in 1080 in the middle using the same lens, and for good measure the Panasonic S1H again at 1080 at the bottom, but using the Lumix 24-105. And now all 3 cameras again in the same order, but this time filming in their 4K modes, with the R5 at the top in its best quality 4K HQ mode. And finally in their highest resolution video modes, with the EOS R5 in 8K at the top, the A7S III sticking with 4K in the middle, and the Lumix S1H in 5.9K at the bottom. Many people will also be comparing the R5 against the Sony Alpha 1, so here's how they look when fitted with the same Sigma 40mm art lens, first in 1080 with the Alpha 1 at the top and the R5 at the bottom, followed by standard full frame 4K at 800% for a really close look, and next in their best quality oversampled 4K modes, which for the Alpha 1 at the top means going for the cropped mode, reducing the field of view, compared to the R5's 4K HQ at the bottom. And finally for them both filming in 8K, but I've had to magnify them further here to 1600%, 16 times magnification in an attempt to tell any difference. And on my screen I'd say they look pretty similar. So do you have any preferences between any of these cameras yet? Okay, how about noise at high ISOs? I filmed this in standard 4K at 1600 ISO, and I'm going to leave it in the middle while flanking it with 1080 footage on the left and 8K footage on the right, all at the same 1600 ISO and all showing the full height of the camera, so this is an unmagnified view. Next for all 3 at 3200 ISO. And now for all 3 at 6400 ISO. Next here's 3 resolutions at 12800 ISO. And finally, all 3 at the maximum movie sensitivity of 25,600 ISO. Now to show the difference more clearly, I'm going to run through that sequence again from 1600 to 25,600 ISO, but this time with each clip magnified by 4 times, so these are 400% views. Again, 1080 on the left, 4K in the middle, and 8K on the right. And before moving on, here's another quick comparison between the Alpha 1 and the R5 at 3200 ISO in each resolution. Oh, and for fun, here's some 8K video that I filmed of the crescent moon after sunset at 5000 ISO. And now for some 4K filmed at 25,600 ISO of Comet Neowise in 2020. Moving on to dynamic range, the EOS R5 allows 10-bit recording with log profiles, and while it was launched with just plain C-Log, the superior C-Log 3 was added by popular demand in a subsequent firmware update. C-Log 3 is the curve used on Canon's cinema cameras and provides greater dynamic range, plus of course better matching with cinema camera footage. You can see some basic colour wheel adjustments to a C-Log 3 clip here in Final Cut Pro. And now for some before and afters, comparing the standard profile out of camera to ungraded C-Log 3 and then C-Log 3 with basic level adjustments. Now it's time to look at movie autofocus, which has been a highlight of Canon cameras dating back to the first models with dual pixel CMOS AF. The R5 cheerfully avoids any restrictions or caveats too, confidently autofocusing across the entire frame from 1080 all the way to 8K and in high frame rate slow motion too. You've been watching it here filming 4K 100p with the RF 600mm f4 and it still easily tracks approaching subjects. Face and eye detection is fully operational while filming animals, with the R5 tracking Steven Seagal's eye here with the RF 85 f2 lens. But if you prefer a slightly more human target, here's yours truly filmed with 3 different 85mm lenses, all on the R5. Moving on to stabilization, the R5 includes built-in sensor shift stabilization that automatically works alongside any optical IS within the lens. You cannot choose one or the other though. Now you've already seen a load of handheld clips filmed with the EOS R5 in this review, but here's another one filmed at 24mm. And at the other end of the scale, one filmed at 600mm, albeit in this case, mostly using the optical stabilization of the lens alone. There's also an enhanced mode that applies extra digital stabilization with a crop, so to demonstrate that and the face autofocus, let's have a bit of vlogging, all in 4K at 24p with the RF 24-70 2.8. I'm filming this first clip without any stabilization at all so that you can see a direct comparison, so without further ado, let's switch it on and see how it looks. Okay, now I've switched on stabilization. Now, as you already know on the EOS R5, if a lens has optical stabilization, it works alongside the sensor shift stabilization in the body. You can't choose one or the other. So in this case, I'm filming with the RF 24-70mm f2.8 lens with optical stabilization enabled, at which point, of course, the sensor stabilization is also applied. Now this, according to Canon, is one of its best combinations that's available in terms of stabilization on the EOS R5. So hopefully you should be getting quite a nice, smooth bit of footage here. Right, now let's see what the enhanced digital stabilization can offer. Okay, I've now switched to digital stabilization set to on. Now, it's also not possible to use this without optical or sensor shift stabilization. You have to have them both running at the same time. So this is now 3 technologies all working together. Okay, now let's have a look at the enhanced mode. Okay, I've now switched to the enhanced mode. So this is digital stabilization set to enhanced, alongside optical stabilization in the lens and sensor stabilization in the body. So this is the EOS R5 working at its absolute maximum, but as you can see, there is quite a tight crop here, so you would not want to be doing any handheld vlogging with enhanced stabilization at 24mm. Obviously, if you have a wider lens, that's going to look quite good, but not at 24. So just before I wrap this up, I'm going to switch back to one of the other modes. Okay, I've returned to the far more sensible digital stabilization disabled, at least more sensible with this lens. So you're looking again at optical and sensor shift stabilization only, all working together on the EOS R5. Again at 24mm f2.8. So let me know what you think of the video quality of this camera. And now it's time for me to wrap up this video.
And finally, before my verdict, a quick look at rolling shutter, starting with 1080 at 24p, and now in 4K at 24p, and finally in 8K at 24p. Now some skewing is certainly visible if you swing the camera around, but I've seen far worse offenders. Okay, now for my final verdict of the EOS R5 for video. While the R5 will delight most photographers, videographers will have more of a turbulent relationship with it. There's no doubt it can deliver great results. 8K, 4K HQ and 4K 120 footage can look absolutely fantastic, whether straight out of camera or ready for grading in 10-bit C-Log 3 or 8K RAW. You also get one of the most confident autofocus systems around with effective face and eye detection for people and animals, decent built-in stabilization, and the benefits of a fully articulated screen. And when most cameras only support RAW video externally, the R5 gives you the choice of internal or external recording and in full 12-bit 8K. This is one of the most feature-packed video cameras on the market today. But as most of you already know, the headline video modes are plagued by the ever-present spectre of overheating, which can see the camera refuse to shoot any more footage in the best modes after as little as half an hour and sometimes, and take a frustratingly long time to cool down. Some will be able to work around it, filming short clips before turning the camera off to maximise recovery times, or choosing lower quality modes when they can't, or simply relying on an external recorder instead, but others will find it frustrating or completely impractical. Given rivals like the Sony Alpha 1 can keep filming 8K until it runs out of power or memory, it's hard not to feel the R5's restrictions are being overly cautious or maybe even artificial at times. It's also annoying to still be limited to half-hour clips when Sony and Panasonic have offered unlimited recordings on a bunch of cameras for some time now. Ironically, even though the R5 aims to be one of the best hybrid cameras around, its hybrid shooters will have to be particularly vigilant, since constant switching between video and stills will prevent the camera from ever cooling down, effectively locking you out of the best quality video modes that you probably bought the camera for in the first place. So wedding photographers, beware, you're going to either need two bodies or an external recorder. Given the initial excitement and expectations for the R5, it's not surprising many were disappointed by the practicality of the camera once it got into their hands. But since launch, Canon has released several firmware updates that have genuinely improved the performance while resolving some strangely missing features like 1080 120p and dual card recording in most modes. And while the R5 initially looked expensive, the subsequent launch of Sony's Alpha 1 made it look like a bit of a bargain. Ultimately, any potential R5 owner needs to be acutely aware of what it can and cannot do, and again for some it's just not going to be practical. You can't kid yourself about this. If you're a videographer who wants a camera to keep shooting and simply get out of your way, then the Sony A7S III, Alpha 1 and Lumix S1H are better tools. But name another full-frame, non-cinema camera that offers 4K 120 and 8K with autofocus. Yep, at the time I made this review, the only alternative was the Sony Alpha 1, costing over $2,500 more. And while it had no overheating issues in my tests, the R5 does sport a flip screen as well as 8K RAW internal or external. Maybe you'd be willing to accommodate the R5's restrictions for that $2,500 saving. Maybe not. Only you can say, but for anyone who's disappointed, there'll be others who adore the R5, as if it can fit into your workflow, or if your workflow can be adapted around it, it really is a tremendous camera capable of really great results. Right, that's another huge review completed, and if you watched all the way to the end, I salute you. These kind of videos involve a huge amount of work, so if you find any of it useful, please do give me a like and a follow, or if you're feeling extra generous, there's links below to treat me to a coffee or treat yourself to my in-camera book. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think of the R5 in the comments. Do check out my other RF lens reviews, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.